born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod, and about that time some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? For we saw his star as it rose, and we have come here to worship him." And King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. And he called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law, and he asked them, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem in Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophet Micah wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are not the least among the ruling cities of Judea, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel." Then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time the star first appeared. Then he told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, come back and tell me so I can go and worship him too." After this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. And they entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chests, and they gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And when it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. Well, first off, I want to start by asking you a question. How many wise men were there? And we typically will say that, just like Tessa did. Typically people will say 3. But the truth is we really don't know for sure. The Bible doesn't say. But we tend to say 3 because there were 3 gifts that the wise men gave to Jesus. So we think of a gift for each wise man. But the reason I read this passage in a different translation, some of you may have been going, that was not quite the words I've heard it read in before. There actually was a reason for that. I wanted us all to hear it as if we were hearing it for the first time, or at least get a fresh perspective on it. Because these are words that are so familiar to us that sometimes we listen without listening. We don't really hear what's being said. Because too often, certain passages, we've heard them so many times that we simply assume that we know and we understand what's taking place. But that's an attitude that can get us into trouble. And as a matter of fact, this attitude is the focus of the text this morning. Now, you may have thought this text was Matthew's way of telling us that a group of wise men or magi, possibly 3, possibly more, came to worship the Christ and to offer gifts. And that's all part of the Christmas story. It's an important part of the Christmas story. But for the next few minutes, I want us to stop and notice something else that's going on here. There's something in the text that relates to an attitude. And as it's revealed, we're going to compare 2 different groups of people that are in the passage of Scripture. Now, the first group of people, in order of appearance, is the wise men. And the second group is Herod and those who lived with him in Jerusalem. Excuse me. The first difference that we notice between these 2 groups is location. According to Matthew's account, the wise men came from the east. This means they traveled a significant distance in order to find the King of the Jews. They had left the familiarity of home, and they had traveled many miles in order to find Jesus. The second group, Herod and the religious leaders, lived right there in Jerusalem. And as a matter of fact, Herod is in his home when these wise men show up and ask to see Jesus. The second difference between these 2 groups is their culture. Since the wise men came from the east, and many people believe they actually came from Mesopotamia, these were Gentiles instead of Jews. On the other hand, with the exception of King Herod, who was half Jewish, the chief priests, the scribes, and the people of Jerusalem were all Jews. These were God's chosen people. God's chosen vessel to share his grace and his love with the world. And the third difference is the difference of sight. The Gentile pagans saw the sign of the star that pointed to the King of the Jews, and those who should have seen the sign of the coming of the Messiah, the chief priests and scribes, didn't see it, or at least they didn't acknowledge it when they did. Well, there's a fourth difference as well. The fourth difference between these two groups is response. The wise men saw the star, and they came in order to worship and bring gifts of adoration to a new king. King Herod, the chief priests and the scribes, heard from these wise men that there was a new king, and we're told that they trembled. They were frightened. So let's recap. The first group, the wise men, pagans from the Gentile world who should have had no interest in what was happening in Jerusalem, hundreds of miles away, leave their homes in security because they saw the star and followed it in the attempt to find the King of the Jews, to worship him and present him with gifts. While those who were there, the chief priests and the scribes, who knew and were looking for the coming Messiah and knew the Old Testament scriptures and who had spent their entire life with those pages, not only didn't see the sign, but when it was announced, they were frightened by what it meant. Do you see what's happening? Those you and I might have believed incapable of responding to the grace of God did so, and those we thought should respond and know what the grace of God looks like reacted negatively. Now understand, it isn't as though God gave these wise men more signs or more chances than his chosen people. As a matter of fact, as you look at the overreaching story, the chief priests and the scribes came from a long line of people to whom God had attempted to reveal himself, and yet they had failed to listen. And here's where knowing the story can lead to missing the point. For we can think we know the scriptures so well, we can think we are so familiar with them that we miss the signs that God gives us as he seeks to speak to us. And that's not just the chief priests of the time when Jesus was born, but us today. Do you hear that? What I'm saying is that we actually can miss God speaking to us. Now, if you would have asked the chief priests and scribes who was most likely to recognize and worship the Messiah, them or some magi from the east, there is no doubt in my mind that they would have been offended at the thought that they would not realize that it was the Messiah, that they wouldn't be the ones to identify him and know who he was. And yet, that's exactly what happened. We don't like to identify ourselves with these chief priests and scribes. When we read the story, I'll bet there's not one person in this congregation that when you read that story thought, oh, well, that's me. More likely, you read the story and you want to be the wise men. If you have to pick somebody in this story to be like, you want to be the wise man. You want to be the one that's coming from far away, searching with all of your heart, looking for Jesus and bringing him gifts. Or you want to be the shepherd who hears the news from the angel and comes to worship Jesus. You don't want to be the chief priests and the scribes, who even though they should have known what was going on, missed the point. They should have known it, and yet they missed the point.